Ladies and gentlemen, I hope that you can hear me. Also, next door where you are having your coffee break, I would like to kindly ask you to finish your conversations, finish your coffee and refreshment, and be so kind and move in. If you would like to join our second panel discussion, where we will talk about climate change and food crisis in Horn of Africa, we would like to start on time, which is 11:10, so that's why I really would like to kindly ask you to finish your coffee break and move in so that we won't be late. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, the time is up. The time is up. I hope that you enjoyed your coffee break and now you are ready to start and listen to the second panel session, which will be focused on a very present issue, which is the climate change and food crisis in the Horn of Africa. At the same time, I would like to draw your attention to Deep Talk, which is starting right now and which will be focused on a different issue. It will talk about donor fatigue and indoor refugee costs, which are rising in some EU member states. And this topic will be more related to Ukraine. So it's really up to you if you choose to stay here with us and listen to a discussion regarding food crisis and climate change in Africa, or you choose to go to the second floor and join debate on the donor fatigue. So we all know that some donors are diverting aid money from, yes, I listen to you. Okay. So I was just asked by the organizers if you could, if you don't mind, if you could move on a little bit further to the front, to sit a little bit more in the front. It might be more convenient to you. You would be more connected with our panelists. You would listen in a better way. So if you don't mind, please move on to the front so that we can see each other in a better way. So, as I said, we all have noticed that after the start of the war in Ukraine, some donors are diverting aid money to Ukraine from other parts of the world, and some African countries fear of a double standard in international aid. So all this will be discussed by Evelyn van Romberg from Oxfam International and her panel guests. So Evelyn, please, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Are we already? No. Good morning, everyone. So my name, maybe let's all come to the stage already. My name is Evelyn van Romberg. I'm the head of Oxfam's EU office in Brussels, and I'm very pleased to be here and to talk about this important topic. And you might think, why are we talking about the Horn of Africa when there's a crisis at our own doorsteps in Ukraine? But I think it's important to discuss and to look around, to have a broad view, and also to realize that the actions that we're taking here have consequences elsewhere. So we'll dive deeper into that when we talk about climate change and the food crisis in the Horn of Africa. The Horn and East Africa are facing one of its most serious episodes of drought in decades, which in the past year, the driest conditions seen in 40 years. Cyclic drought is paradoxically often followed by severe flooding, as is happening already right now in Somalia, washing away crops, destroying homes and livelihoods, and contaminating water supplies. And these extreme conditions add to the devastation already caused by the triple effect of massive desert locust infestation, prolonged conflict, and the after effects of the COVID-19 crisis, all of which have contributed to destroyed harvests and a dramatic inflation of food prices. And the urgency of the situation is exacerbated by increasing food and fuel prices because of the Russian invasion in Ukraine. And this is also partly due to the region's dependency on wheat and other commodity imports, but also because the war in Ukraine is diverting much needed attention and resources from the international community. So in this panel, we will talk about the combined food crisis and climate crisis in the Horn, about how African countries, particularly in the Horn, already acutely facing the impacts of climate change, with average temperatures rising in this region much faster than anywhere else in the world, and rainfall significantly decreasing, while 95% of farmers are dependent on this rainfall. And at the same time, Africa as a continent is the least responsible for the climate crisis, with emissions being less than 4% of the global emissions. And we will also talk about the current level of hunger, with 26 million people across Kenya, Ethiopia, Somalia, and South Sudan still facing IPC 3 or higher, so both crisis and emergency levels of hunger. But importantly, we will also talk about solutions at local, national, regional, and global level, and what the role is of local organizations, of NGOs, of UN agencies, EU, and EU member states, including Slovakia. I don't want us to go away feeling depressed, so as Tanya already mentioned in her introduction speech, hunger and the climate crisis are man-made, which also means that solving them is a question of political will and political power. So I will do that with an esteemed panel. I'm very happy to introduce them. Together they have an amazing amount of knowledge and expertise in the region and on these issues, and it's my honor to introduce them. So first, we have Paula Girak, Head of Relief and Development Department of People in Need, Slovakia. Then Vladimir Šučka, Head of Representation of the EU Commission representation here in Slovakia. Next to him is Petr Kandalovic, Director at the Department for Development Cooperation and Humanitarian Aid at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Czech Republic. And next to him is Frederick Lee Olsen, Director of the United Nations World Food Programme Office in Brussels. And online we have Hilary Chariot, Programme Officer at the Eastern African Farmers Federation. So welcome to all of you. Thank you for joining me in this panel. We will have 3 sections. The first one is focusing on the crisis, both climate and food, in the Horn. And in the second session, we'll talk about solutions, as I mentioned. And then the third one is for questions from the audience. So don't be shy. And while the panelists are already talking, please think about comments or questions that you would like to pose. Are we ready? Let's start. So we will start with the food crisis in particularly. Our unequal global food system is unsustainable for people and planet, clearly, with an abundance in one part of the world and extreme wealth for food traders in particular, while hundreds of millions of people are going to bed hungry each night. And the food crisis in the Horn of Africa is also not new, but it's exacerbated by the war in Ukraine, as I said. So, Frederick, if I can start with you, how has the Russian invasion in Ukraine affected an already dire situation in the Horn of Africa? And what are some of the underlying causes, like Ukraine or other causes of hunger in this particular region?
Thank you, Evelyn, for that question. And I think the simple answer is that it is really affecting the situation in the Horn of Africa very much, because I think, as you all know, Ukraine was the breadbasket of the world, not only of Europe. And so, of course, the war has really had a devastating impact on global food prices, and of course also of Ukraine's export of grain to the rest of the world. We were fortunate to have the Black Sea Grain Initiative that the UN brokered, and that allowed for the export of 32 million metric tons of grain from Ukraine. But as you all know, that agreement was not renewed by the Russian Federation this summer. And so we are very concerned of the consequences that this will have. As you may also know, many of the countries in the Horn of Africa are food import dependent. That means that the agricultural production is not sufficient to cover the domestic needs. So that is why they have to import food. And the issue was that the grain from Ukraine was the cheapest on the world market, and also because of the routes, this was really an important destination. So that is really having a very detrimental direct effect in terms of food prices going up. And that basically means that people in the Horn of Africa will not be able, prices go up, and they will not be able to afford food. And we are really seeing this as the World Food Programme, right, in this region. We've seen in the last 8 years 150% increase of people that are food insecure. That means, exactly as you said, people that go to bed hungry. And that means that we are now at 65 million people that are food insecure in the Horn of Africa. That is 10 times the population of Slovakia. It's staggering, simply. And so the war in Ukraine really has a direct effect on that. But it also has, and as we just heard, it also has indirect effects, right? In the sense that the world's attention is focused very much on the war in Ukraine. Now, of course, also what's happening in the Middle East. And that means that the Horn of Africa is getting less attention from the international community, and with less attention, that also means less funding. So we are very concerned about both the direct and indirect consequences of the war in Ukraine. But as you said, Evelyn, it is not entirely new. We can't blame all on the war in Ukraine. There were really underlying causes. Certainly conflict. Conflict is the main driver of humanitarian needs and of food insecurity in the Horn of Africa. It's the same thing globally. And it's just enough to look at the world, right? The war in Ukraine, we've had conflict in Armenia, we have now in the Middle East. So 3 out of 4 people is really because of conflicts. And there are plenty of them also in the Horn of Africa. We have in Somalia, we've had in Ethiopia. Luckily, we now have a peace agreement there. So the conflict levels are down. But then when we all thought that that was good, then Sudan happened, right? And basically throwing the country there into conflict. And there the situation is really alarming. I would say catastrophic. I mentioned 65 million people that go hungry or food insecure in the Horn of Africa. 20 million of those is in Sudan. 20 million of those in Sudan. In Sudan alone, 6 million people are in what we call it an IPC4, which means on the brink of starvation. So that's the whole population of Slovakia that is really in that. So that is just, an example of how conflict really drives it. But then there's also the increasing effects of climate change that is really hitting the Horn of Africa with both droughts and floods. So basically heavy rains that is, exacerbating the floods, and of course increasing heat that is leading to droughts. And we had the worst drought in 40 years in the Horn of Africa. And why is that? That is because of the climate crisis. And unfortunately, it is not going to be the last one. So we really got huge challenges to deal with here in the Horn of Africa. And I think it's really so important that our organizers here is bringing attention to this part of the world that is Horn of Africa.
Thank you so much for setting that quite depressing scene, if I may say so. You were mentioning that Ukraine is the breadbasket of the world, but at the same time, there's so many farmers also in the Horn of Africa. So I want to go to Hillary. Can you hear as well? And are you able to speak as well?
Yeah, you can hear you. I only need a confirmation that you can hear me well.
Yes, great, we can. Thanks, Hillary. So you are working with, amongst others, small-scale farmers across the Horn of Africa, and small-scale farmers provide more than 70% of food supply, both in Asia but also in sub-Saharan Africa. So could you tell us a little bit about the problems that they encounter, particularly now?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. I have a limited internet here, so I would want to respond with my video put off. There has been a bit of a challenge when it comes to farmers accessing the international market. If you look at the Ukrainian war and, of course, challenges around COVID for the last 5 years, there has been so many challenges relating to the farmers. The small-scale farmers have actually had the cost of productivity of their value chain is really going up. This is occasioned by the fact that a lot of the inputs that are being used are actually imported. So, like I said again, the cost of production of the inputs is very high, and most of the farmers are currently facing financial challenges to really acquire these inputs. The second challenge that the farmers are facing within the East African region is their capacity to produce the right qualities to meet the market. This has been occasioned by the fact that there is no support to really ensure that these farmers clearly understand the kind of certification and the requirements to produce, the right marketable varieties or marketable products. The other challenge is the efficiency of the systems that cushion them. Mentioning about climate change, we still do not see, early warning systems that could really support the process of production as we see the climate change effects. Then also, when it comes to the different governments within the country, we do have a lot of poor investment by the government on infrastructure. Remember, one of the things that really the farmers want to see is an enhanced market. So this is not really happening. We do not see resources being channeled to support the infrastructure around the market. The aggregation centers have not been supported well, and most of these products is actually sold through channels that do not really contribute to the farmers' cost. So looking at the cost of production versus what the farmers are getting, there is a big disparity. The last challenge that I would want to bring forward on this forum is the fact that the engagement of the farmers in the negotiation process is not what has been happening. For the COP meetings that have been happening to deliberate on the actions around climate change has not really been very engaging for the farmers. So it's one area that it really needs to be brought about so that then we can see global and continental representation when it comes to the negotiations on the course of action for climate change. So those are the key challenges that farmers do face. But again, it's very important to also look at the farmers as a unit and not single farmers. So the aspect of aggregating the farmers for ease of even letting the information flow within the farmers is also very important. Those are the key challenges that I would say, through the previous challenges around COVID, around the Ukrainian war, have really, been seen within the Horn of Africa among the small-scale farmers. Thank you.
Thank you, Hilary, and thanks for highlighting, well, first of all, of course, the impact of the climate crisis, but also the difficulties with access to markets, infrastructure, and resources. I want to go to Peter about a trip that you and your team organized last year for the European Council Working Party on Humanitarian Aid and Food Aid and the Working Party on Development Cooperation to Sudan as part of the Czech presidency of the EU. And the humanitarian needs in Sudan, particularly in Darfur, are immense. Frederick already mentioned them earlier. Could you say something about what you saw there and the issues in particular this part of the Horn?
First of all, thank you for including me to your panel. And also thanks to the organizers of Ambrela to including this very important issue to our discussions, because we really need to have an argument towards those in Africa that we not only look at Ukraine, but we still keep an eye on what's happening in Africa, in other countries that need our help. And well, to the delegates' trip, as presidency, obviously you always take the baton from the predecessors, but the situation changes. So originally, Sudan was among 6 pilot countries for the European humanitarian and development segment to study the nexus, hopefully the connection between humanitarian development and peace activities. But that was after Bashir regime was toppled, civilian government was established, and everything was looking much better in Sudan in those days. When we were preparing as our presidency the trip, the civilian government was gone, and some sort of military junta again ruled Sudan under General Burhan. And of course, those rapid forces which were behind the war in Darfur were still there. So when we were preparing the trip, we very carefully discussed the security situation, because it's not an easy thing to bring almost 30 delegates of EU member states, who are mostly junior diplomats, many of them women, to a country like Sudan. And from today's perspective, you may even think that we were crazy, because in fact we took the trip in December last year, and as soon as in February, March, the war between Burhan and Hemeti's forces began in a full scale, including attacks to Khartoum, and basically even hitting, the EU ambassador's place, and one of the members of the team of DG ECHO was actually shot, and thanks God he survived. So it means that it wasn't a joke, it was a very difficult situation, but at that time and I wish to thank WFP for basically organizing the whole logistics and security part of our trip, and also UNICEF participated. So I'm trying to explain this, that situation in such context develop, and you have to make decisions under certain circumstance, and from a later perspective it might really look irresponsible, but at that time we simply said to ourselves, together with the security branch of the WFP, that it is worth going and seeing. And now, after this lengthy introduction, I just want to say, what did we see? We saw, of course, that the nexus was gone. The nexus at that time, and of course, again, it was still before the hot conflict. Still, at that time, it was gone because of the military junta. The Burhan's regime, the EU discontinued all, and not only the EU, I believe that it was basically the world community discontinued any development cooperation program. So what we saw is that it actually spilled over to the humanitarian part. So extreme amounts of resources were spent to basically feed people who could, when there was a development program, they could participate in some programs and to some extent feed themselves. Repercussions of conflicts in the field were causing new and new IDPs, and the need to basically feeding these IDPs rather than some programs that would maybe help local farmers to reconcile with the herders, because this is one of the main issues and main causes of local conflict in this country. So again, what we saw is that when we are not able to maintain development angle or development part of our activities, it immediately spills over to the humanitarian needs. And now, of course, there's no longer discussion about development programs in Sudan because of the hot war. But again, this as an example, this was very telling.
Thank you so much for that, and also for painting this picture of how things were relatively stable and promising in one moment and then deteriorating so quickly, right? And throwing everything that was built up overboard. We'll come back to the nexus and see if that might be a solution, or how to organize it in a better way so that it can be a solution. But I now want to go to Paula. It's building a little bit about this focus on conflict, because Sudan, of course, is not the only country in the Horn that faces severe internal deadly conflicts, contributing to millions of people either being internally displaced or fleeing across borders. Again, with Sudan or Chad seeing an immense number of people being fleeing now from the conflict in Darfur. So, Paula, what do you think is the role of climate crisis in particular when it comes to conflict?
So thank you very much for the question. So the correlation between conflict and climate is not that obvious at first when we look at it. But when we start analyzing the situation, it comes more and more evident. So of course, population in the Horn of Africa or in a greater Horn of Africa, they are not strangers to droughts or to the conflict, because conflicts in Horn of Africa were happening even before we started focusing so much on the climate change and environment in humanitarian sector, but also in development. So these two things are not new, but due to the climate changes that are actually caused by developed countries, right? Because we are responsible in Europe, in China, in the United States, we are responsible for the emissions in majority. I think that the whole continent of Africa, they contribute only 4% comparing to others. But then they feel the consequences of this climate change because of their geographical position, right? So this equidistant position between equator and Tropic of Cancer. So the temperatures are rising much faster, and the rainfalls are decreased. So now talking about the conflicts and how the climate change causes that conflicts or fuels into that conflicts is the competition over livelihoods. And you mentioned the movement of the population. So mobility was kind of the adaptation of the population, because they were moving from one place to another to seek water, to seek livelihoods. But now this competition is increased because of the droughts, the disrupted cycle of the droughts and decreased rainfalls. We have a population which is dependent on that agriculture, and 95% of the farmers are dependent on the rainfalls. So, we have competition over livelihoods, which is causing the conflict. Then we have the displacement and movement of the population. So it's not also that obvious that climate is causing the displacement, because displacement is a very complex process or thing, let's call it that way. But they are moving to the lands to seek water, for example, because groundwater levels are decreasing as well. And they are coming to the land which is already owned. or they meet other population living there, and they are started competing over jobs, over the grazing lands as well, because usually they also move with their livestock. And then I think that last thing I wanted to mention, about the conflict, is that this is used by the armed groups and by the political actors. So they use natural resources, and here we talk about natural resources in majority on grazing lands and water, that, for example, they start putting taxation, they use it as a tool for to gain more power, right? So, I mean, the armed groups and the armed actors are also influenced by the climate change, but I think that sometimes they are also benefiting, and they are causing that conflict. So, the other thing that I wanted to mention is that also conflicts are contributing to the climate change, but we are talking about a different context, because it's more obvious maybe in the Middle East, where some power plants and some factories are targeted and we are polluting a lot, right? Here, the conflict looks a bit different, but also, it contributes to the collapse of these institutions, and these institutions are very important later to work on the climate adaptation. Thank you.
Thanks for that. And this is very complex, first of all. It's very interesting how you pointed out that mobility, human mobility, is actually a coping mechanism, right? And a way to adapt to changing circumstances. But if those circumstances change so fast and so dramatically that it's more difficult, and then you get this conflict around resources as well. Thanks for that. Vladimir, I would like to ask you about funding. None of the UN humanitarian appeals for the region are fully funded. The humanitarian response plan for Somalia, for example, is at 30%. The HRP for Ethiopia is funded at 30%. And the one for Ethiopia is also at 30%. What do you think is contributing to these low amounts, particularly given, the level of crisis that we discussed? And how is the EU, as one of the most important donors in this region, dividing its attention between increasing humanitarian needs worldwide, including in Ukraine? And how can we bring all EU member states, including Slovakia, into this knowledge about the need to continue with this humanitarian funding?
Okay, thank you very much for the question, for invitation, but also in general terms for this unusual type of conference for Slovakia, because in Slovakia we are not really very often are talking about development. We are almost never talking about Africa. And I just would like to share with you my African story. And how I, as a Slovak, never been exposed a part of zoo and some elephants and some nice stories about Africa, how I became a big advocate in the European Commission for Africa. I was in my previous job in the Commission responsible for global trends, strategic foresight, and with my colleagues we were putting together, figures and looking at the mega trends and etc. And then obviously you can't miss Africa. If you see what is happening in Africa and what is ahead of us in Africa, but in Europe, my conclusion was that future of Europe is in Africa. And this message, is very difficult to pass on. And it's definitely almost impossible to pass on in Slovakia, because this is so far. It's so strange for people in Central Europe that I'm afraid that it may be too late for us to realize that this is an important issue, and I'll just will try to explain why. I think it's so crucial. The only continent which is now at the exponential curve of demographic explosion is Africa. By 2050, our demographic scenarios are showing that 25% of global population will live in Africa. If we go back to 1900, it was 8%. If we go to 2100, it will be over 40%. But maybe 2100 is too far, but 2050 is not that far. And it will be 25%. So it's much more, it's double what we have in Africa now. You mentioned this staggering number. When I first looked into Africa, it was only 30 million starving. But right now, only in the Horn of Africa, 1 person is dying out of hunger every 36 seconds. So in 1 minute, 2 people only in Horn of Africa is dying out of hunger. Just to show, you mentioned this stormy spring in Sudan in your contribution, and I look into the numbers within 1 month of this conflict. Only in Sudan, 1 million people were displaced. Out of them, 200,000 left Sudan. So then I think that we need to, and then you mentioned climate change. Africa is responsible for 3% of the global CO2 emissions. 3%, but Africa is the continent suffering the most out of climate change. And it's not only Horn of Africa, but it is, I think, extremely exaggerated and visible in the Horn of Africa. One day we have huge droughts, or in one part, huge droughts. And then the other day we have huge floods, killing all what we call arable land. When I have my speeches, when I have also slides, I use very fascinating slide and picture of the world arable land existence. And if you look at Ukraine and Europe and North America, it's full of arable land. If you look at Africa, it's already too small for current African population. And it's in decline. You know how much we lost only the forest worldwide in the past 2 decades. Twice the size of Spain. 100 million hectares, twice of the size. So it's roughly every 30 seconds we are losing the arable soil of the space of one football stadium, one football pitch. So it's catastrophic, and most of it is happening in Africa. So then you have huge increase of population, which is now becoming exponential. You have fantastic impact of climate change. You have all conflicts you may imagine in Africa. So you have disaster, the natural disaster stemming from climate change, but also from other phenomena, and you have extremely sluggish economic growth. Economic growth last year for all Africa was 3.3%. I was just talking because I just came from Brussels from meeting with all ambassadors globally, and I was talking to my friend who is EU ambassador to South Africa, very economically strong country. Economic growth is 0.7. So it's not enough. It's not enough. So that's why also in the Commission we invented an approach which we call the nexus of food, water, energy, and ecosystem. Because this is, for me, the crucial ecosystem worldwide in the light of the climate crisis. But for Africa, it's absolutely essential because you need to decide. You need water for energy, you need water for food, and you need water for ecosystem, and you need all 3 at the same time. So then it's really absolutely crucial to go in this direction. So that's why I think that we still have time until 2050 or 2040 to bring the Africa and cooperation with Africans to the front. And it's not about charity. So I think this is extremely dangerous to talk about the charity. So this is the most vibrant region, the most vibrant continent. 70% of population of Africa are young people under 30. So they will not be staying there and dying out of hunger. They will go out. And the current crisis which is hitting, the migration crisis which is hitting Europe is just a peanut if you compare it with these tens of millions. You know, the estimate of climate migrants by 2080 is 800 millions. Maybe exaggerated, but even if it is half, it's killing. And I think this is something where we still have time. And new technologies may help us because, you know, artificial intelligence can perfectly help us to boost our knowledge and technology for food production in Africa. But we need to deploy it. We should really look at Africa as investment to our future, because otherwise it may be at a certain moment too late. Okay, coming to your question.
Very.
I think that you
please much briefer than your introduction.
Very briefly, I think that's a wrong question, or it's a good question to wrong person or the wrong institution. European Union is not one of the most important; is the most important donor of Africa and worldwide. Just let me know. You know about this initiative for Horn of Africa, which is the initiative of all countries in Horn of Africa. EU created EU Alliance for the Horn of Africa, and only for this initiative, European Union gave since 2019 860 million euro. This alliance, which is Team Europe approach, is not the Commission, it's not the institution, is the institution together with the member states. So this is elaborating and mobilizing more money. And if you want me to tell you how much it is for each country, I can tell you it's not important that much, but it's hundreds of millions on the top of this initiative for each and every country. So my answer is that Europe is doing, of course we can do more. But I think that it's not the EU should be asked why this is not being done. It's also responsibility of other superpowers which are extremely rich in the world to come and add also some money to this pocket. And EU will do even more than is being done right now.
Thank you for that. I'll come back to that question on how the EU then can assure that other donors or other big powers can leverage their funds as well as the EU is doing. So I'll go back to you. I very much like what you said, there's still time, because that's the positive, right? That's the optimistic approach. And I promised that we didn't want to go back from or away from this panel feeling helpless or completely depressed. So what can we do to anticipate and respond to worsening hunger? What can we do to build resilience against climate change and mitigate the worst effects and support people in this region to adapt to a crisis that they contributed to the least? And what is then the role of each of us? I'm going to ask you to answer briefer than in the first round, otherwise we are running way over time and we're standing between you and lunch, which is not a great place to be in, so please be brief. Petra, I would like to start with you. You already mentioned the nexus is gone, right? At least that was the case in Sudan. But you are a member of the global coalition of the Triple Nexus, so that's the interlinkage between humanitarian development and peace actors. Can focusing on the nexus be part of the solution?
Well, it has to be. I mean, when we were in Sudan, what we saw there was actually that the missing part was the development part of it, and it of course represents a big dilemma to what extent the development cooperation actors like the EU and other donors are prepared to actually be dealing with governments that we do not like in the first place. Because obviously if there was a decent government and rule of law and transparency, they might not have these problems that we see. So in fact, when we were there, and again I'm talking about the time before the real war, it was at that time relatively calm, and we were asking ourselves, was it really necessary to hold all development programs, because they again basically pop up in the humanitarian situation. So that is the confirmation that the HDP nexus is needed, but it's not easy. It's not easy, and it's different in all contexts. When we were in Afghanistan, you remember these province reconstruction teams, the PRTs, where the military tried to cover for, not cover for, but make it possible for development actors to actually deal with local communities to improve their lives. So this was actually one of the attempts to do the P. And what we did as Czechia, when we were the presidency, we actually, together with the Commission, developed a series of recommendations, which then were published by the presidency. So we have recommendations on good practice of the Nexus published as a document by the EU. The other part of the problem is not the conflict, not hunger, but disaster. And this was our second priority, disaster risk reduction, where we also achieved even higher level of agreement among member states, because we actually got an agreement on council conclusions on DRR. So these are recommendations that should lead all the actors to think in these connections. From one end, connecting the H, D, and P, and from the other point, which is also D, it's the disaster risk reduction activities that should prevent or prevent losses of lives and damages, and basically make populations that are affected by the effects of climate change, make them more resilient against all these climate extreme situations.
Thank you. First of all, so thanks for pointing out that all these different contexts are, of course, different, right, and thus need a different approach. And also that, you know, there's a lot that's already been developed around Nexus, as you said, but it's also now about implementation, right? And similar is true for local humanitarian leadership, where there's a lot of talk about it, but now we need to go to the implementation. So Paula, I would like to ask you, we all know that localization is crucial in humanitarian action, as it puts the communities that are affected at the heart of the response. So what do you think is needed to really deliver on local humanitarian leadership?
Thank you very much for the question. So I will not directly answer this question, because I wanted to comment on some things which were actually said also in previous panels about CSOs in Ukraine. And I think that one of the panelists, Mr. Valery, he was mentioning climate change mitigation, that they would love to work on that. But since they have conflict, they have to focus on different things. And I think that we have similar situation in several countries in Horn of Africa or Greater Horn of Africa. Like population is struggling because of the conflict, and since they don't have water, they don't have food, so for them their priority need, of course, is like life-saving assistance. that humanitarian organizations are providing. So then we lack capacities to look more in the future and to have medium and long-term approaches. We sometimes are forgetting about peace actors. So I think that, there is one thing that we can do, which is like localization, so building platforms for communication, for knowledge exchange that we can do as international actors to build capacity, but based on what is already there. Because as I mentioned previously, this population is not a stranger to the droughts and to the conditions that they are living in for years. So they already know some mechanisms. So for example, pastoralists, they know ecosystem and they know that land also need to recover. So they need to move, right? So yeah, we can learn from them, and based on their knowledge, we can bring platforms for coordination, for knowledge exchange, listen to them, have this cooperation. But I think that, it's really hard to think about that development and climate adaptation response, if we need humanitarian assistance. So we need to come up with some solutions that would allow us to combine short-term, medium-term, and long-term response, and combine cooperation between humanitarian actors, development actors, and peace and security actors as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, and also for pointing out the need to really listen to the people on the ground, right, who know best, also what's best for them. Hillary pointed out to something similar already. Is he still with us? Because I'm a bit afraid that he isn't. Hillary? No, okay. All right, then we move to Vladimir. So I already pointed out that I wanted to ask you that. You said the EU is already funding a lot in the region, and you are right. At the upcoming European Humanitarian Forum in March in Brussels, the lack of funding or the funding gap, particularly linked to the increase of needs, humanitarian needs, is one of the key topics. And I know that the EU and the Commission have really tried to get other types of donors also into the, into the context. So what do you think is the role of the EU, or how can we bring these other donors to also make sure that, that these funding needs are being secured?
Well, this overall approach of the EU is based on the three pillars. The first pillar is this traditional humanitarian aid and development aid. The second pillar is development, the business, development, the trade, development, the economy in the countries. And the third pillar is resilience, resilience against wars and conflicts, but also resilience against natural disasters, resilience against the climate change, etc. So then in all three, you have actually different types of donors, or I would not call them donors, more partners, because if you really want to develop the trade and the business, so then you're talking about profit as well, and that can be good, and then you can have a variety of different actors which are there. The same is for resilience, the sustainable farming, etc. So then you can really have very good partnerships. So this is the aim of the Union, is to this Team Europe approach, that all member states, but also all member states, not only governments, but also the private sectors, the non-governmental sectors, etc. in the Europe, but also globally to attract different partnerships in this respect.
Thank you. And highlighting resilience, I think, is key, and it's also something that Paula was referring to. When you are in the midst of a crisis, it's very hard to think longer term, right? And anticipatory action could be one of the ways in which we make sure that there's more resilience and that we build capacity to deal with the different crises that are currently happening in the Horn and elsewhere. Frederick, the last question is for you. You recently met with different ambassadors from Ethiopia, South Sudan, and Somalia in Brussels to discuss how to address food security and how to work together to achieve zero hunger. What are some of these short and long-term actions that you discussed and that need to take place in the Horn?
Well, thank you, Evelyn. I mean, I think that there are three tracks, right, that we need to proceed on, and that is really part of all the discussions that we're having. I mean, first and foremost, we need to redouble efforts to find political solutions to some of these conflicts. As I mentioned, 3 out of 4 people are food insecure because of conflict. So it's the primary driver of humanitarian needs and food insecurity. And I'd mentioned Sudan, 20 million people that are food insecure, 6 million people acutely so. We're seeing 7 million people that are displaced because of the conflict, 1 million people that have become refugees, that have fled to neighboring countries. And, you know, I mean, half of them have fled to Chad. It's not one of the most richest or most stable countries in the region. 300,000 out of those, they have fled to South Sudan, which is in itself mired in conflict. So this is really where we need to redouble efforts. We got in Sudan 2 generals that, you know, are fighting. And so I think it's really, you know, the responsibility of the international community to double down on finding political solutions to these crises. Now, the second issue, and I think that is really, of course, we must sustain humanitarian assistance. And I think that goes to the question of funding. I mean, we are very grateful to donors such as the European Commission and EU member states, you know, that are really the ones that are allowing us to deliver food, emergency food, to people in need. But the picture is pretty dire. I mean, as World Food Programme, last year we had the generosity from donors of mobilizing $14 billion in support of our operations worldwide. Right now we are at $6 billion, so we're not even half. We're not even half of the funds that we received last year. And that means that we have to cut food assistance everywhere. So speaking of this country, we're cutting 50% of our food rations in Somalia. We're cutting 50% of our food rations in South Sudan. We're cutting 50% of food rations in Ethiopia. So that is the consequence of that. And so while we are very generous and we really praise the European Commission and its leadership in the European Humanitarian Forum, and also reaching out to new donors, emerging donors, to get more really to the table, because it is really, lives really depend on that. But then the third thing, and I think perhaps even so important, and Peter, you really touched upon it, I really think, you know, the Czech leadership last year was really critical, is I think we need to rethink how we do the nexus. Because for several reasons. I mean, and I'm speaking about the D part, right? I mean, as you saw in Sudan and as you just witnessed about, right, the development, what happens is the development support is frozen, it's suspended, and the consequence of that is that humanitarian caseload increases. So we need to rethink that there are things that you can do. You don't need to do budget support through governments. There are other ways of doing it. Doing it through a people-centered and community-based approach. It also goes to what you, Paula, was saying, and we do that. Now, the second thing is really climate change. As I said, you know, conflicts are very difficult to anticipate, but climate change and climate-related disasters, they are, thanks to all technology that we got today, they are much more possible to anticipate. So we really need to invest in anticipatory action. We need to invest in resilience. I visited northern Kenya earlier this year. You know that Northern Kenya and southern Somalia was hit by the worst drought in 40 years, and that was because of the climate crisis. We managed, World Food Programme, to avoid a famine last year in this place. We did, of course, due to very generous support of the European Union and others, but we also did it because we had managed to invest in resilience, and so that the populations were more resilient to actually respond to this. So I think that it is so important that we really double down on the resilience. And then the third element of it is really the climate funds. Now, you would imagine, right, that in a place that is one of the most vulnerable to climate change, that is the Horn of Africa, that you will have a massive mobilization of the multilateral climate instruments that we got, such as the Green Climate Fund for climate adaptation. But they are, frankly, they are missing in action in the Horn of Africa. And so I think that this is really a critical issue that we need to address. This is one of the most climate vulnerable places. We need to make sure that our climate adaptation, our multilateral climate funds also are present in these places. One of the top 10, and this goes beyond Horn of Africa, but one of the top 10 countries which are most climate vulnerable is Afghanistan. How much of our climate funds are available or made available in Afghanistan? It's peanuts, close to zero. So that is really, I think, a critical issue also that we need to do. You may call it nexus, but certainly we need a combination of these tools, finding political solutions, doubling down on sustaining humanitarian assistance, and really rethink the way that we do D. I think, frankly, in a lot of places, it's not so much about development even. It is about stabilization. It's in the Sahel, for example, it is about stabilization, preventing some countries from collapse. And you just mentioned, right, I mean, it's 70% of the population in Africa is under 30. And I think this is really, should be in the interest of solidarity to assist, but it is frankly also a question of national security long term to really not abandon places such as Horn of Africa.
Thank you for that. We have time for one or two questions from the audience. Is there someone who has a comment or wants something to be clarified by one of the panelists? Yes, all the way in the back. Can someone bring a mic? All the way in the back? No, that's not the back. There, all the way in the back, yes. Short question, please.
Hi, my name is Martina Slabová. I'm from American Chamber of Commerce in Slovakia. My question is to anyone from the panelists. I'm very proud citizens of the Europe who are showing solidarity and a very high level of the altruism. It's great that Europe is supporting and the US is supporting a lot of GEOs which are in the problems. My question is what is the role of the United Nations to activate other GEOs who are benefiting, for example, from Africa by providing the goods, taking the minerals, etc., or using the labor force of African people? How UN, or what is the role of the UN to activate those other representatives of globe to support more as well and to be solidar as well?
Thank you for that question. So I don't think that this is for anyone specifically, but is there anyone who would like to answer? So the role of solidarity and migration, asylum. Migration was already mentioned by you as well. Maybe you want to answer?
I can answer this from the EU perspective. I said I came from Brussels. We have been discussing exactly this issue that the approach towards Africa and also South America is not just to go extract the minerals and then bring added value in Europe. So it is exactly, the deal is always to go and develop the capacity, industrial capacity, and then to bring this industrial product to Europe. So then the people are not having only dirty jobs there, but they have the jobs with a higher added value. And I don't think that there are many regional powers which are doing this. And I think that that should be eventually the role of UN also to show this, that, you know, it's not only to go and exploit whatever and then to go home. I think this is extremely important. I think that this example of the European Union should be followed by many.
Frederick?
Yeah, no, just to agree, I think that we also need really to understand, I mean, we speak about Africa as sort of, you know, we just need to understand that we have to look at each and specific country, have a targeted approach. I mean, there really, I think, as you said, you know, there are countries that are really making incredible progress, and it has a booming economy, you know, that is in the front of technology. You know, look at countries like Ghana, look at countries like Nigeria. We have, you know, a lot of, but then there are, of course, also countries where we see turmoil and we see crisis. So I think that one of the first things is that we, and I say, you know, certainly from the United Nations, but also from donors and in Europe, we need to look at Africa in a new way. We need to rethink, I think, our, let's say, the EU policy or donor policies when it comes to Africa. It's not just one size fits all. In places where you have governments that really want to create sustainable progress for the populations, and we need to build there, you know, very strong partnerships, and that is what we're doing in the United Nations. But then there are other places where it is much more challenging to operate, where basically you do not any longer even have functioning state institutions because of conflict or otherwise. And so I think that is really, you know, why we need to rethink policy.
Peter, very short, and then...
Well, speaking of the HDP nexus, we spoke a lot about this connection between humanitarian and development, but of course there is this P element in it, and it doesn't necessarily need to be only peace. It's like really good governance and democracy building and things that we even may call distribution of wealth. Because what we, of course, see many times is that in capitals people drive expensive cars that we will never have, while a couple of 100 kilometers in the areas people live in desperate conditions. So the distribution of wealth, tax collection and right governance is also, of course, and again, it cannot be one size fits all. We cannot come there and mentor these people like we know better and you have to do like we do. We really need to sit with them and try to find solutions that work and, you know, take examples from one place to the other and be patient, because without this D and P element, we will always face extreme needs for the age.
Thanks, and very good that you are highlighting also the inequality in many of inequality is rising across the globe and also in African countries. So it's very important also to address that. And I like what you said about tax collection and how important it is to build up also public services, right? Because that's another way to build resilience and to be ready for when a crisis comes. Paula, and then I need to wrap it up because we're out of time.
Yeah, last few words, because I think that like donors and even international organizations, we need to be more inclusive. Like we were speaking about localization, but sometimes we are like putting so strict requirements, and like we are not making fast decisions. We are not very nimble with our actions. So sometimes like CSOs, they are asking like we need funding because like the rain season is coming and we need like for the agricultural activities, but then we make very slow decisions and like it's already after the rainy season and we need to wait another several months, right? So I think that, yeah, like nimble, fast decisions, flexibility and less restricted funding, because yeah, like even institutions are like, it differs from country to country, but the institutions are weak. So CSOs, they also have weak policies. Sometimes even international organizations struggle, right, to meet all those requirements before they receive funding. So I think that, yeah, we need to make it more flexible, more inclusive and faster.
Yeah, thanks. You're completely right that local humanitarian leadership or localization is not just a task from donors or from the EU or the UN, but it's also something that's for INGOs, right, or for CSOs. Thanks so much. Thank you for listening. Thank you for hearing us out. Thank you for sharing all your insights about the causes of both hunger and climate crisis in the Horn of Africa, but also for sharing your solutions and for going away here hoping with a little bit more hope and optimism about how we can all play a role in the different organizations in which we work on how to address these issues. There's been a lot. There was talk about political solutions, about building resilience. The nexus came, and in particular also the role of development actors when it comes to anticipatory action. The COP is coming up, so the climate summit is coming up soon. This is also really a space to talk about how we can support African countries who, again, have contributed the least to climate crisis with the consequences of it. So there's a lot to do, and I hope we can all play a part in that. So thank you again to the great panel, and thank you all for listening. I hope you have a really lovely day. Thanks.
Thank you, Evelyn, and thank you to all your panelists for highlighting the very important fact that with all eyes on Ukraine, we should definitely not forget about other parts of the world, not only Africa, but also Afghanistan, as it was said, which are also in urgent need of international help. Ladies and gentlemen, now it's time for lunch, and I kindly would like to ask you to come back here at 1:30, 13:30. Come back here if you would like to watch our afternoon panel session or deep talk. That's the same time, 1:30. Please be so kind and come on time because we don't want to have a delay.